Echoes call from hollow halls, a voice that creeps and softly crawls. Time stands still, the air is...
Before we begin, please note that viewers' discretion is advised. In the year 1936, the world saw a photograph that would forever redefine how people viewed hardship and resilience. It was titled Migrant Mother, captured by Dorothea Lange during one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Great Depression. The photo showed a woman with deep, worried eyes, surrounded by her children who clung to her for warmth and safety. Her name, unknown for decades, was Florence Owens Thompson. The image became iconic almost instantly, appearing in newspapers across the country. It wasn't just another photograph. It was a cry for help that moved the nation. Shortly after its publication, aid poured into the very region where it had been taken, helping thousands of starving families. Over the years, it would appear on magazine covers, postage stamps, murals, and even jigsaw puzzles. Part of what made it spread so widely was that it was public property. Lange had taken it as part of her government work for the Farm Security Administration, meaning anyone could reproduce it. But the real reason it endured wasn't because it was free to print. It was because it was hauntingly beautiful and deeply human. The photo captured so much emotion in a single frame. The way the children hid their faces from the camera, the texture of their tattered clothes, and the silent strength of their mother's expression told a story words could barely touch. Lange later said that she was drawn to Florence as if by a magnet. She didn't ask many questions, just raised her camera and took the shot. Florence, 32 at the time, told her that her family had been surviving on frozen vegetables and birds her children caught in the fields. She said they had even sold their car tires to buy food. To Lange, this moment represented the essence of American struggle, and her photograph reflected that heartbreak. But years later, the truth came out, and it was more complicated than anyone realized. When Florence was finally identified in the late 1970s, she told a newspaper reporter, "I wish she hadn't taken my picture." Her family too recalled a very different version of events. They weren't destitute pea pickers as the caption claimed. They had simply broken down near the camp when their car's timing belt snapped. While Florence waited with her children, her husband and 2 older kids had gone to town to buy the replacement part. She cooked food and tended to her little ones in a makeshift shelter, unaware that the photograph being taken would one day define her life. Her son later clarified that they never sold their tires because they had none to spare. The family was poor, yes, but not starving. They were on their way to another job when their lives momentarily intersected with Lange's lens. Florence's story was not one of hopelessness, but of perseverance. She worked endlessly, picking cotton by day and cleaning restaurants by night to feed her children. Those who knew her remembered her as a proud and determined mother, not a helpless victim. Florence's children often shared stories that revealed her true nature. Her daughter Ruby once said, "She gave us a sense of worth that nobody owes us anything." Another daughter, Catherine, recalled how her mother would skip meals to make sure her children ate.
If she could have gave us all these material things, maybe she would have. But that I don't think would have replaced what she did give us. She gave us all a sense of worth that nobody owes us anything.
Despite all the hardship, Florence never allowed her children to see her as broken. Her strength was quiet but unshakable. By the time the picture was taken, Florence had remarried a man named Jim Hill and had another baby. Their family traveled constantly, chasing seasonal farm work across California. That day in March, they were headed toward the lettuce fields when fate, disguised as a broken-down car, placed them before Dorothea Lange's camera. The photograph's fame brought food relief to many struggling workers, but ironically, Florence and her family were long gone by the time the aid arrived. They moved on to the next field, unaware that their image had become a symbol of an entire generation's suffering. Over time, Florence found small measures of stability. After World War II, she took on whatever work she could, bartending, cooking, and nursing. She raised 11 children, each one a living testament to her endurance. In the 1970s, her grown children helped her buy a small house in Modesto, California. But Florence preferred the simplicity of a mobile home. Then in 1983, after suffering a stroke, she faced mounting medical bills. Her children made a public plea for help, and people across the country responded. Donations poured in, raising $35,000, along with thousands of letters from strangers who felt moved by her story. One letter read, "That picture of your mother gave me great strength, pride, and dignity, because she exuded those qualities." Florence passed away soon after, But the letters brought her family peace. For decades, they had viewed the photo as a curse, a reminder of how their mother's image brought fame to someone else while they continued to struggle. Yet as they read those messages, something changed. They began to see the photograph not as a symbol of pity, but as proof of her strength. The photo no longer represented despair, it represented resilience. Florence had never wanted to be the face of poverty, but her image came to symbolize the quiet courage of mothers everywhere, who carry their families through the storm. When she was finally laid to rest, her children had her gravestone inscribed with the words, "Migrant Mother, a legend of the strength of American motherhood." And in the end, that's what she became. Not a symbol of sadness, but of survival. Florence Owens Thompson was more than a famous photograph. To the world, she was a legend. To her 11 children, she was simply Mom. Before we go any further, I just want to ask you for a small favor. If you're enjoying the video so far, please give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. We are pushing to hit 200,000 subscribers before the year ends. It feels impossible, but I know we can achieve it together because your support has been unreal. I know you'll subscribe, so without wasting more time, let's get back to the video. On the morning of December 8th, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono met with photographer Annie Leibovitz in their New York apartment for what would become one of the most hauntingly beautiful photographs in modern history. The session was meant for the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, and the original plan was for John to be photographed alone, but he refused. He wanted Yoko in the frame, the woman he called his other half. Leibovitz agreed, and envisioned an image that would reflect their deep connection. In the final shot, Lennon lay completely unclothed, curled around Yoko, who was fully dressed in black. The image told a story of love, of trust, of devotion, but no one could have imagined it would also capture his final hours. That same afternoon, the couple left their apartment to head to the record plant studio. As they stepped outside, a man waited among the small crowd of fans, Mark David Chapman. He held a copy of Double Fantasy, Lennon's latest album. When Lennon approached, Chapman asked for an autograph. John smiled, took the record, signed it, and handed it back. Photographer Paul Goresh even captured the moment. Lennon's signature frozen in time on the very album held by the man who would take his life just hours later. Inside the studio, Lennon spent the evening recording Yoko's song Walking on Thin Ice. Those who saw him that night said he seemed peaceful and happy. Around 10 o'clock, the couple wrapped up and got into their limousine to return home. Lennon leaned back, satisfied with the day's work, unaware that it would be the last time he would ever leave a studio. When they arrived at the Dakota, their Manhattan residence, the night air was calm. They stepped out of the car and began walking toward the entrance. Yoko went ahead, and behind her, Chapman emerged from the shadows. He called out, "Mr. Lennon." When John turned, Chapman raised a revolver and fired several shots.
Mr. Chapman came up behind him and called to him, "Mr. Lennon," as he arrived at that doorway. And then in a combat stance, he emptied the Charter Arms .38 caliber gun that he had with him.
Yoko screamed as Lennon collapsed near the doorway. The building's doorman shouted for help, and police officers nearby rushed to the scene. They found Lennon bleeding heavily, and realized there was no time to wait for an ambulance. They placed him in the back of a patrol car and sped to Roosevelt Hospital. Doctors and nurses worked frantically to save him. They opened his chest and began internal cardiac massage, but the damage was too severe. 4 bullets had struck his chest, with 3 exiting through his back. For 30 minutes they fought to bring him back, unaware at first of who they were treating. One of the doctors later recalled seeing Lennon's driver's license and American Express card, whispering to himself in disbelief, "It can't be John Lennon." When the truth sank in, the room fell silent, except for the sound of medical equipment. A few minutes later, John Lennon was pronounced dead. He was 40 years old. Outside, reporters gathered as the devastating news spread across the world. Fans began flooding the streets around the Dakota, holding candles and singing his songs through tears. Lennon's music, his words about peace, love, and imagination, suddenly carried an unbearable weight. Meanwhile, Mark David Chapman stood calmly nearby, waiting to be arrested. When officers confronted him, he didn't run or resist. Instead, he quietly told them he had done something terrible. Later, when questioned, Chapman spoke about 2 people inside him. one good and one dark, and claimed the darker side had won that night.
I turned to him and I said, you know, you just threw your whole damn life away. Chapman started talking about a little person inside of him and a big person inside of him. The big person has been winning the battle up to now, but tonight the little person won the battle.
Back at the hospital, Yoko Ono was told her husband was gone. Overwhelmed with grief, she was escorted back home through a sea of fans and flashing lights. By then, the world already knew. The man who sang Imagine was gone. In the days that followed, New York City transformed into a place of mourning. Thousands gathered outside the Dakota, lighting candles, playing guitars, and singing Beatles songs in unison. Across the globe, radios played Give Peace a Chance on repeat. Even people who had never met him felt the loss deeply, as if a piece of the world's optimism had vanished with him. 5 years later, in 1985, Yoko Ono and then Mayor Ed Koch dedicated part of Central Park to Lennon's memory. They named it Strawberry Fields, after one of his most beloved songs. From her apartment window in the Dakota, Yoko can still see the memorial, a mosaic with a single word in its center. Imagine. Fans visit every day. Some leave flowers. Others quietly hum the tunes he wrote decades ago. The photograph taken that morning by Annie Leibovitz now hangs in museums and history books, immortalized as both a celebration of love and a reminder of how fragile life can be. When people look at it, they don't just see a musician and his wife. They see a moment of intimacy that unknowingly became a farewell, a final embrace between two souls bound by art and affection. Even today, decades later, Lennon's spirit lives on in the songs that continue to echo across generations, songs about peace, hope, and the courage to dream of a better world. In a sense, he never really left. His voice, his vision, and that hauntingly beautiful photograph ensure that somewhere, somehow, John Lennon still sings. On the 6th of December 1969, around 300,000 people gathered at the Altamont Raceway in California for what was promised to be a historic free concert. It was described as the Woodstock of the West Coast. The event was meant to celebrate peace and love, but what unfolded was chaos, tragedy, and one of the darkest moments in music history. The Rolling Stones were in the middle of their biggest American tour since forming in 1962, but many fans complained that ticket prices were too high. In an effort to make amends and connect with their audience, the band decided to stage a massive free concert. The goal was simple, a celebration of the counterculture spirit. But unlike Woodstock, which had been planned for months, Altamont was thrown together in just a few weeks. At first, organizers tried to host the concert at San Jose State University, but after previous disruptions, the venue withdrew. They then shifted plans to Golden Gate Park, and later to Sears Point Raceway, before finally, only days before the show, settling on Altamont Raceway. It was a desperate move. The switch came so late that the stage and equipment had to be torn down and rebuilt overnight. In the rush, many basic needs were overlooked. Toilets, medical tents, and proper barriers were never set up. The layout of the new site created its own problems. The stage was placed at the bottom of a slope, meaning the massive crowd would tower above the performers, standing almost at the same level. There was no real separation between artists and fans, just a thin line of makeshift barricades. With hundreds of thousands of young people expected to attend, the organizers faced another pressing issue: security. The Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, both heavily involved in the festival, recommended hiring the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The Angels were notorious, but they were also affordable. Reportedly, their payment came in the form of $500 worth of beer and an open invitation to enjoy the concert. It was a decision that would haunt the event forever. By dawn on that cold December morning, waves of people poured into Altamont. The atmosphere was already uneasy. Sam Cutler, the Stones' tour manager, later said that as the sun rose, the view from the stage looked less like a festival and more like an army camp. The energy felt wrong. The lights weren't set up properly, sound towers were unstable, and people were climbing structures for a better view. As the day went on, alcohol and drugs flowed freely, and tension began to thicken in the air. When the crowd pressed forward, the Hells Angels pushed them back, often with fists, pull cues, or anything they could find. Fights broke out repeatedly. The promise of peace and love started to crumble before the music even reached its peak. The band Santana opened the show but had to stop when a fight erupted on stage. Jefferson Airplane followed, but during their set, things spiraled further. A motorcycle belonging to a Hells Angel was knocked over, sparking a violent brawl. The band's singer Marty Balin tried to calm things down, only to be knocked unconscious by one of the angels. By the time Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young performed, the atmosphere was toxic. Stephen Stills was even stabbed in the leg with a bicycle spoke. Word of the violence reached the Grateful Dead before they took the stage. They took one look at the situation and left immediately, saying they couldn't perform under such conditions. That decision left the stage empty for hours, allowing the crowd's restlessness to boil over. When the Rolling Stones finally arrived, things were already out of control. As Mick Jagger stepped out of the helicopter, someone in the crowd punched him. The hostility was obvious, but the band pressed on, hoping the music would calm people down. It didn't. During their third song, Jagger had to stop performing to plead with the audience to sit down and stay calm. "Brothers and sisters," he shouted, "we're all one." But his words were drowned by the noise and growing tension. Then came the moment that turned the concert from chaos to tragedy. 18-year-old Meredith Hunter and his 17-year-old girlfriend Patty Bredehoft were among the thousands watching. Patty wanted to leave after hours of fights and fear, but Meredith convinced her to stay. He didn't want to miss the Rolling Stones. During the song Under My Thumb, Meredith climbed onto a speaker to get a better view. The Hells Angels dragged him down, and a scuffle broke out. Surrounded and panicking, he pulled out a gun from his jacket. It was a small act of fear that instantly escalated the violence. A 21-year-old Hells Angel named Alan Passero lunged at him and stabbed him multiple times. Within minutes, Meredith collapsed. He died at the scene. The tragedy didn't end there. 2 others were killed in a hit and run after the concert, and another young man drowned in an irrigation ditch nearby. In one night, 4 people lost their lives. In the aftermath, Altamont became a symbol of everything that went wrong with the idealism of the 1960s. What was meant to be a peaceful gathering became a nightmare that exposed the cracks in a generation's dream. Cars were stolen and abandoned. Property was damaged, and hundreds were injured. The Altamont Raceway was banned from hosting concerts afterward. Alan Passaro was arrested and charged with Meredith Hunter's death. But in 1971, a court found him not guilty, ruling that he acted in self-defense. For the Rolling Stones, the shadow of Altamont never faded. The footage of the event, captured in the documentary Gimme Shelter, showed the moment chaos overtook the music, the instant when peace turned to panic. In the end, the Altamont Free Concert stood as a dark bookend to the decade that promised love and freedom. It marked the symbolic end of the hippie era, a reminder that even good intentions can crumble when chaos takes control. Decades later, that haunting photo of the crowd, the band, and the Hells Angels still serves as a warning that sometimes, what begins as a dream of unity can spiral into a tragedy no one forgets. It was the morning of January 28, 1986. The air at Cape Canaveral carried the chill of winter, but excitement filled the hearts of millions watching from across the United States. At exactly 11:30 that morning, 7 astronauts boarded the Space Shuttle Challenger, ready to make history. Among them was Sharon Christa McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from New Hampshire. She wasn't just another astronaut. She was about to become the first civilian in space, the face of NASA's Teachers in Space program, and a symbol of hope for an entire generation of students. As the crew ascended the launch tower, they were calm, focused, and full of anticipation. Commander Francis R. Scobie led the team, joined by pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, along with payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. Cameras captured their smiles as they waved to the cheering crowd. The sky was a perfect shade of blue, and the countdown echoed through the speakers. Inside classrooms across America, children were glued to television screens. Teachers paused their lessons so their students could witness what was meant to be a historic step for mankind. Parents at home, scientists at NASA, and news anchors on national networks all shared one collective breath of excitement as the countdown reached its final seconds. At 11:38 a.m., the boosters ignited with an explosion of bright orange flames. The shuttle lifted off the pad, trailing white plumes of smoke into the Florida sky. Cheers erupted. The Challenger climbed higher, the ground shrinking beneath it, leaving behind a roar that shook the air. Inside the shuttle, the crew's voices filled the communications channel. There was laughter, brief exchanges, and technical confirmations. Pilot Michael J. Smith, a Vietnam veteran, gave a confident grin as he said, "Go, you mother." While feeling the immense force of acceleration, his words were met with excitement. Judith Resnick, the electrical engineer with the calmest demeanor on the team, shouted in joy, "Okay." The mood was lighthearted, and for the first minute, everything seemed perfect. But at 58 seconds into the flight, something happened. Something invisible to the human eye, but catastrophic in consequence. A faint spark had appeared on one of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. It was tiny, almost unnoticeable, but it marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would change history forever. At 1 minute and 10 seconds, Commander Scobie instructed Smith to throttle up. 3 seconds later, Smith responded with a brief, uneasy "uh-oh," and then silence. 73 seconds after liftoff, the world witnessed a scene that would haunt generations. The Challenger, still visible in the sky, suddenly burst apart in a cloud of smoke and fire. The once graceful ascent turned into chaos, as trails of vapor arced downward. From the ground, it was impossible to grasp what had just occurred. For a few seconds, the audience didn't react. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then, panic spread. News anchors struggled for words. NASA's flight dynamics officer finally broke the silence. "We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded." Pieces of the shuttle rained down into the Atlantic Ocean as the realization set in. The Challenger had been lost. The crew never made it to space. They perished either during the fall or upon impact with the ocean. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately, but it was already too late. Among those watching live were hundreds of school children, including Krista McAuliffe's own students, who had gathered to see their teacher become a national hero. Instead, they saw tragedy unfold before their eyes. In the hours that followed, television networks replayed the footage repeatedly, the image of the twin smoke plumes, one rising upward, the other splitting apart into two curved trails. It became one of the most haunting visuals in modern history. The laughter and pride that had filled classrooms just moments earlier were replaced with tears and disbelief. In the weeks that followed, NASA's investigation uncovered what had gone wrong. The cause lay in something seemingly insignificant. Rubber O-rings used to seal the joints of the solid rocket boosters. These rings were extremely sensitive to temperature, and that night, the weather in Florida had been unusually cold. The low temperature had hardened the O-rings, preventing them from sealing properly during liftoff. This failure allowed hot gas to escape and ignite the external fuel tank, triggering the explosion. The recovered operational recorder, found 100 feet below the Atlantic Ocean, revealed the crew's final moments. The tape contained their conversations, jokes, and even small observations about the shuttle's instruments. Everything had seemed normal, until that last "uh-oh." The simplicity of that phrase, a single instant of realization before the end. It struck a chord with everyone who heard it. For Krista McAuliffe, it was meant to be a dream fulfilled. She had been chosen from 11,000 applicants, a teacher who would bring space exploration closer to the next generation. Her mission was not just about science, but inspiration. And yet, her story became one of heartbreak and caution. In the aftermath, the Challenger disaster reshaped NASA's entire approach to safety. The space program was grounded for nearly 3 years, as engineers worked to ensure such a failure would never happen again. Memorials were built, scholarships were created, and the 7 astronauts were honored as heroes, who had given their lives in pursuit of knowledge. But even decades later, the Challenger's legacy remains a powerful reminder of how fragile human ambition can be. That photograph, the shuttle ascending proudly into the sky just seconds before the explosion, it captures not only the beauty of exploration, but also the devastating cost of human error. Every year, people gather to remember the Challenger crew. Teachers still tell their students about Krista McAuliffe, the woman who dared to dream beyond her classroom. And though the mission ended in tragedy, her spirit and the courage of her fellow astronauts continue to symbolize the unbreakable drive to reach for the stars, even when the sky itself seems unforgiving. In the spring of 1996, Mount Everest became the setting for one of the most haunting stories in modern adventure. It began as the journey of a lifetime. Climbers from all over the world gathered at the base of the tallest mountain on Earth, determined to stand on its frozen summit. But as history would soon show, not all of them would make it back down. Adventure Consultants, founded in 1991 by Rob Hall and Gary Ball, was among the most respected guiding companies in the world. The duo had climbed the tallest mountains on every continent, earning the nickname the Seven Summiteers. But tragedy had already touched their story. Gary Ball lost his life in 1993 while climbing with Rob in the Himalayas. Rob continued the company's legacy, leading more expeditions up Everest in 1994 and 95. Meanwhile, another company called Mountain Madness, led by Scott Fisher, shared the same dream, bringing paying clients safely to the summit. By May of 1996, both Hall and Fisher had led teams through the dangerous Khumbu icefall, preparing for their final ascent. The mountain was crowded that season, with climbers from South Africa, Taiwan, and even a film crew shooting an IMAX documentary about Everest. Rob Hall's group was made up of both professionals and ambitious amateurs. Among them were Doug Hansen, a postal worker attempting the mountain for the second time after turning back near the summit the previous year, and Yasuko Namba, a determined Tokyo businesswoman who had already conquered 6 of the 7 summits. There was also Beck Weathers, a pathologist from Dallas who had recently undergone eye surgery and struggled with his vision at high altitude. Scott Fisher's team was equally diverse. Experienced climbers like Charlotte Fox and Anatoly Bukriv alongside newcomers like Sandy Hill Pittman, a wealthy socialite documenting her journey. The plan was simple on paper: ascend slowly through 4 high camps to let their bodies adjust, then make a final push from Camp 4 near the South Col. But Everest has never been simple. The first sign of trouble came early. A member of the Taiwanese team fell 60 feet into a crevasse near Camp 3, and later died from his injuries. The mountain had already claimed 1 life before the summit push even began. On the evening of May 9th, climbers prepared to make their final ascent. Hall instructed his team to stay within 500 feet of one another, but delays started almost immediately. The ropes that were supposed to be fixed ahead of them had not been set. This forced climbers to wait in the bitter cold, while guides struggled to secure lines. Hours passed, oxygen tanks ran low, and yet many pressed on, determined to reach the top, no matter the cost. Beck Weathers could barely see. The thin air worsened his eyesight, and Hall told him to wait where he was until he returned. That decision would soon prove life-threatening. By early afternoon, climbers began reaching the summit. But long after the agreed 2 o'clock turnaround time, when everyone was supposed to head down, Scott Fisher reached the top at nearly 4, visibly weak. Others were still ascending even later. Then, without warning, a storm rolled in. Winds howled, temperatures plunged, and the clear day turned into a white nightmare. Communication broke down. Climbers were scattered across the mountain. Hall was stuck high up with Doug Hansen, who had collapsed near the summit. He radioed for help, but the blizzard made rescue impossible. Andy Harris, one of his guides, tried to reach him but vanished in the storm. Further down, groups from both expeditions lost their way in the dark. Blinded by snow and exhaustion, they huddled together for warmth, just a few hundred meters from Camp 4, terrified they might walk off a cliff if they moved. Anatoly Bukriv, who had descended earlier without clients, ventured back out into the storm at dawn. He managed to save 3 climbers, Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, and Sandy Hill Pittman, but could not reach Yasuko Namba or Beck Weathers. Yasuko was unresponsive. Beck, his face and hands frozen, was believed to be gone. But hours later, something unthinkable happened. Beck regained consciousness. Half buried in snow, he somehow stood up and began walking alone toward camp. His face was frostbitten beyond recognition, his hands blackened, yet he refused to give up. When rescuers saw him staggering through the snow, it was as if they were seeing a ghost. By the next morning, Rob Hall was still alive, high on the mountain. Over satellite radio, he spoke to his wife, Jan Arnold, who was 7 months pregnant back home in New Zealand. They said their final goodbye, knowing he would never make it down. Hours later, his body froze where he had fallen, near the summit he loved so much. When the storm finally cleared, the mountain revealed the full cost. 8 people were gone: Rob Hall, Doug Hansen, Andy Harris, and Yasuko Namba from Adventure Consultants, Scott Fisher from Mountain Madness, and 3 members of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police team. It was the deadliest disaster in Everest history at that time. Days later, a helicopter daringly reached Camp 2 to rescue survivors too weak to descend. The altitude was so high that the aircraft barely managed to hover, but it saved those who could still move. Beck Weathers, miraculously alive, was one of them. His survival became one of the most incredible comeback stories in mountaineering history, though it cost him both hands and part of his face. Books, documentaries, and films would later tell the story of that May tragedy. The world learned of the human decisions, the delays, and the courage it took to face such conditions. But behind every retelling was the same haunting truth. On Everest, nature always has the final say. The disaster of May 10th and 11th, 1996 remains a chilling reminder that even the most experienced climbers can be humbled by the mountain. For some, Everest was a dream. For others, it became their final resting place. And for those who survived, like Beck Weathers, it was a second chance at life carved from the heart of the world's highest and most unforgiving peak. The Titanic was meant to be the grandest ship ever built, a floating city of luxury and ambition, a British ocean liner operated by the White Star Line. It set out to cross the Atlantic from Southampton, England to New York City. But what began as a dream voyage in April of 1912 would soon turn into one of the darkest moments in maritime history. The Titanic struck an iceberg in the freezing North Atlantic, and within hours it disappeared beneath the waves. To this day, it remains the deadliest peacetime sinking of an ocean liner. Built at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Northern Ireland, the Titanic stretched nearly 900 feet long and boasted 10 decks. It carried people from every walk of life, the wealthy and powerful in first class, and hundreds of hopeful immigrants in third class, chasing the promise of a new beginning in America and Canada. Among the photos preserved from that voyage, a few stand out not just for their beauty, but for the haunting stories they tell. One of the most touching is of a boy on the deck. In the famous 1997 film Titanic, there's a short scene of a child spinning a toy top as passengers stroll by. That moment wasn't fiction. It was based on a real photograph taken aboard the Titanic on April 11, 1912. The boy was 8-year-old Robert Douglas Bedden, a first-class passenger traveling with his family back home to Tuxedo Park, New York, after a holiday in Algeria. In the image, Robert is seen playing happily, unaware of what was coming. When the Titanic struck the iceberg days later, he was asleep in his cabin. His nanny, Elizabeth Burns, gently woke him, telling him they were going to see the stars. Robert drifted back to sleep, never realizing the ship was sinking. When he opened his eyes the next morning, he was in a lifeboat, one of the lucky few to survive. But fate had other plans. Just 3 years later, in 1915, Robert tragically died in a car accident in Maine at a time when cars were still a rare sight. His death became one of the earliest recorded automobile accidents in the state's history. Another haunting image linked to the disaster shows what is believed to be the very iceberg that ended the Titanic's journey. Just 2 days before the sinking, a British sea captain named W. Wood, commanding a merchant vessel called the Etonian, photographed an enormous iceberg while crossing the same stretch of ocean. He carefully noted its coordinates, and astonishingly, they matched almost exactly with the location where the Titanic would later collide. When Captain Wood arrived in New York, he sent the photo to his family with a letter claiming it was the iceberg that caused the tragedy. He even wrote on the photo in bold ink, "Iceberg taken by Captain Wood SS Etonian at 41 degrees 50 minutes north latitude and 49 degrees 50 minutes west longitude on April 12th at 4 p.m. The shape of the iceberg in his image closely matches sketches and eyewitness descriptions given by Titanic survivors, making it one of the most chilling photographs in maritime history. Then there were the passengers in third class, often overlooked, yet they made up the majority of those on board. Photos from the Titanic's lower decks show families settling into small but clean cabins, children exploring narrow corridors, and travelers dressed in their best clothes, full of hope for a better life across the ocean. Unlike most ships of that era, the Titanic's third-class passengers had access to dining areas, shared bathrooms, and even running water, a small luxury for people used to rougher conditions at sea. Still, their accommodations were far from ideal. The constant hum of the engines filled their rooms, and when disaster struck, they were trapped deep below deck. Of the 700 passengers traveling in third class, only a quarter survived, and most of them were women and children. For many, the dream of a new beginning ended in the icy waters of the Atlantic. Another eerie image that remains part of Titanic's story is that of the ship's life jackets. They were made of cork and canvas and tied with ropes, designed to keep people afloat, but their construction proved dangerously flawed. When the ship went down, many who jumped into the freezing sea were knocked unconscious by the force of the impact, and their life jackets couldn't protect them from the cold. Decades later, after the Second World War, Life jacket designs were improved, but a few original vests from the Titanic still survive. Today, they sell for staggering amounts at auction, relics from a night that changed history forever. One more unforgettable photograph shows Captain Edward J. Smith, the man who commanded the Titanic, standing beside his quartermaster Hugh Walter McRae. The photo was taken just 3 days before the ship sank, by a passenger who got off in Queenstown, Ireland. It would be one of the last known images of the captain alive. Captain Smith was a respected sailor with a long career, known for his calm demeanor. On the night of April 14th, the temperature dropped sharply, and the ocean surface turned glassy smooth, conditions that made spotting icebergs nearly impossible. Despite receiving multiple warnings about ice in the area, Smith maintained full speed, confident his crew could steer clear of danger. He wasn't on the bridge when the Titanic struck the iceberg. When told of the damage, he called for the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who assessed the situation and quietly told him the truth. The ship was going to sink. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, the Titanic slipped beneath the waves. Captain Smith was last seen on the bridge, refusing to abandon ship. Some stories claim he tried to rescue a child, though that was never proven. His body was never recovered. Even today, people still debate his actions, whether his confidence blinded him to danger, or whether he simply faced an impossible situation. The photographs taken before and during that voyage serve as haunting reminders of human ambition, hope, and tragedy. Each frame captures a moment frozen in time, moments that seemed ordinary back then, but became part of one of the most devastating events in history. And that brings us to the end of this episode. If you found this video informative, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what we drop next. We cover stories like this almost every day. And trust me, you don't want to be left behind. If you can't wait until the next upload, there are more videos popping up on your screen in just a few seconds. Click one and keep watching. Until then, take care. I'm out.